It was a bright, clear afternoon when the phone rang at the Mitchell household. Sheriff James Mitchell had just returned from his shift and was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. His wife, Linda, was in the other room, sorting through some paperwork. The phone call shattered the quiet afternoon. Sheriff Mitchell. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "There's been an accident. It's your daughter, Emily." The words hit James like a tidal wave. His heart raced, and his hands trembled as he stood up from the table. "What happened? Is she okay?" His voice cracked, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. The dispatcher on the other end tried to reassure him. "It's bad, Sheriff. Emily's been in a car accident. Her vehicle was flipped multiple times. She's being rushed to St. Mary's Hospital now. We need you to get there as soon as possible." James barely heard the rest of the conversation. His mind raced, thoughts flashing through his head. Emily, his only daughter, had always been the light of his life. She was brilliant, full of potential, and had just completed her first year of college with honors. The thought that something might have happened to her, that she might not make it through this, was almost too much to bear. Without thinking, James dropped the phone and rushed out of the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he slammed the door behind him and jumped into his patrol car. Linda, hearing the rush of footsteps, came out just in time to see him speed off down the driveway. "James," she called, but it was too late. He was already gone, the sound of the engine fading in the distance. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every red light seemed to last an hour, every second stretching out like a lifetime. James couldn't stop imagining the worst. He had seen the aftermath of countless accidents in his career, but never one so close to home. Emily was his daughter, his little girl, the one he had raised, protected, and guided through life. She couldn't be gone. By the time James reached St. Mary's Hospital, the place felt eerily quiet. He dashed inside, his boots clicking loudly on the tiled floor, and made his way to the emergency room. Nurses and doctors moved around him in a blur, all too focused on their work to acknowledge him. His mind was too fogged with fear to process much of what was happening. He only knew one thing: he had to find his daughter. He approached the reception desk, his voice shaky as he asked for information. "Emily Mitchell. I need to see my daughter. Where is she?" The nurse behind the desk looked at him with a sympathetic expression. "Sheriff, please, just take a seat. We'll get an update for you as soon as possible." She gave him a small, but helpless, smile. James didn't know how to respond. He could only nod numbly, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. His mind was still spinning, and all he could think of was Emily, how she was lying somewhere, fighting for her life, while he was stuck here, helpless. The reality of the situation started to settle in like a heavy weight on his chest. Minutes turned into hours. As James paced back and forth, he tried to calm his nerves, but the waiting felt unbearable. Every passing moment without word from the doctors only increased the fear gnawing at his insides. What was taking so long? Why wasn't anyone giving him answers? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor appeared in the hallway. James rushed to him, his voice urgent. "How is she? My daughter. How is Emily?" The doctor's face was serious. "Sheriff Mitchell, we're doing everything we can, but her injuries are severe. She's in critical condition. We need to get her into surgery immediately." James's stomach dropped. The words "critical condition" were the worst he could hear. His daughter, his Emily, was fighting for her life, and all he could do was stand there, powerless. Sheriff James Mitchell stood frozen, his mind reeling as the doctor's words sank in. Critical condition. His daughter, Emily, was fighting for her life, and there was nothing he could do except wait. His chest tightened as he glanced over at the sterile white walls of the hospital corridor, the endless echo of footsteps around him. He had been in this environment countless times before, but this felt different. This was his daughter, his flesh and blood, lying unconscious somewhere on the other side of those doors. The doctor, a tall man in his mid-40s, clapped James gently on the shoulder. "We're going to do everything we can, Sheriff. She's in good hands. I'll keep you updated as soon as we know more." He gave a sympathetic smile, but it did little to soothe James's racing heart. "Thank you," James muttered, though his mind was far from the man's reassurances. As the doctor walked away, James couldn't help but feel like he was losing precious time. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, like a ticking clock counting down to something irreversible. He turned to the waiting area, but his eyes were unfocused. His thoughts were consumed by the image of Emily, her bright eyes, her infectious laugh, the way she had always been a beacon of hope in his life. Now she was in critical condition, alone in that cold, sterile room, and he had no control over what happened next. The helplessness gnawed at him. Minutes dragged by, becoming hours. James couldn't sit still. He paced back and forth in the hospital corridor, his mind racing. He needed to know more. He needed to be there for Emily. But the hospital staff was too busy to give him updates, and there was little he could do but wait. Around him, other families were in the same waiting area, some chatting quietly with each other, others sitting in silence, their eyes empty with worry. James barely noticed them. His entire focus was on Emily, on the chance that she could survive this. At one point, the nurse at the front desk approached him. Her face was somber, and her voice low. "Sheriff, we're having a bit of a problem. It's about the doctor assigned to your daughter's care." James's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Dr. Carter is handling her, right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if unsure of how to continue. "There's been some interference with her treatment. Some of the security staff, well, they've been refusing to let Dr. Carter perform the necessary procedures." James felt his blood run cold. "What? Why?" "I'm afraid they don't want her to treat your daughter," the nurse continued quietly. "There are some concerns about her race." She lowered her voice even more. "Some of the security guards don't feel comfortable with a black doctor attending to you, Sheriff." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. His face flushed with anger and disbelief. He had never imagined something like this could happen, especially not here, in his own town. "Are you telling me that someone is blocking Dr. Carter from saving my daughter because of her skin color?" James's voice trembled, both from fury and frustration. The nurse nodded, looking uncomfortable. "I'm afraid so." James stood still for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. His mind raced. Images of the security guards, his own subordinates, flashing before his eyes. These were people he had worked alongside, trusted to protect his town. How could they allow something so horrific to happen? His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he felt a surge of rage that threatened to boil over. Emily's life was on the line, and here they were, letting their prejudices interfere with the care she desperately needed. His heart pounded as he realized the gravity of the situation. Not only was his daughter's life in danger, but the very principles he had sworn to uphold as sheriff were being shattered in front of him. James's heart was pounding in his chest, the rush of adrenaline almost drowning out the voice of the nurse. Racism. The word hit him like a slap in the face. His daughter was lying in critical condition, and instead of receiving urgent medical care, she was being delayed because of the color of the doctor's skin. The realization was almost too much to bear. He had worked with many of the hospital staff for years. Some of them he had known since he took office. He had trusted them to uphold their duty to the community. But now, right in front of him, he saw the ugly truth. His daughter's life was at stake, and personal biases were standing in the way of her treatment. The nurse, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, gave James a sympathetic look. "Sheriff, I'm sorry. I wish I could do more, but the guards and some of the staff have made it clear they don't want Dr. Carter treating your daughter. It's just been an issue." James's vision blurred with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He had always considered this town his home, a place where people, no matter who they were, could feel safe and cared for. To hear that his daughter was being denied care because of prejudice was a bitter, gut-wrenching reality. His hands were shaking, but his determination was unwavering. He couldn't allow this to continue. He couldn't let these people dictate the course of his daughter's life based on ignorance and hatred. Without another word, he turned sharply and headed toward the emergency room. His boots thudded heavily against the tile floors as he moved quickly down the hall, his mind racing. When he reached the ER, he spotted Carl, one of the security guards stationed at the entrance. Carl was an older man, a no-nonsense type of guy who had worked at the hospital for years. James had always thought of him as dependable, a good officer in his own right. But now, as James approached, he saw the unease in Carl's eyes. "Carl," James said sharply, his voice calm but forceful, "I need you to tell me what's going on. Why is Dr. Carter being blocked from treating my daughter?" Carl looked uncomfortable. His eyes darted toward the nurse's station before returning to James. "Sheriff, it's not that simple. There are concerns. Some of the staff just aren't comfortable with a black doctor treating." James didn't let him finish. "So you're telling me that my daughter's life is being put at risk because of her doctor's skin color?" His voice was cold, his fury now evident. Carl shifted uneasily, his face reddening. I don't think I can say much more." "Then let me make this very clear," James continued, stepping closer to Carl. No one is going to stop Dr. Carter from treating my daughter. If you or anyone else has a problem with that, I'll personally make sure you never work here again. Do you understand me?" Carl nodded quickly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes, Sheriff." Without waiting for a response, James turned and walked into the emergency room. Dr. Carter was at Emily's bedside, working tirelessly, her expression focused yet strained. When she saw James, her eyes flickered with gratitude, but also with exhaustion. She knew what had been going on, what was happening outside the room, and she knew how high the stakes were. "Dr. Carter," James said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "No one is going to stand in your way. Not anymore." She gave him a quick nod, but the relief on her face was unmistakable. "We're almost there, Sheriff," Dr. Carter said quietly. "But I need to keep working. I won't stop until she's stable." James nodded resolutely. "I know you won't." As he stood there, watching Dr. Carter continue her work, a heavy weight settled on his chest. The battle wasn't over yet. His daughter was still in danger, and so much of the fight lay outside this room, against the forces of prejudice that had tried to undermine everything he believed in. But in this moment, he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anything or anyone take his daughter away from him. The emergency room was silent except for the soft beeping of monitors and the low hum of medical equipment. James stood still at the foot of Emily's bed, watching Dr. Carter as she worked with methodical precision. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight with frustration and rage. The news he had just uncovered was a hard pill to swallow. People he had trusted, people who were supposed to be on the front lines of care, were now standing in the way of his daughter's life because of their bigotry. But the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. James knew that racism didn't just vanish with a few words or gestures. It ran deep, like a silent poison, infecting the very heart of his community, and now threatening his daughter's life. He needed to act quickly. Every minute counted. He turned to Dr. Carter, whose brow was furrowed in concentration as she adjusted the IV line. "Is she stable enough to talk to anyone?" James asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. He didn't want to distract her from her work, but he needed answers, and he needed them now. Dr. Carter glanced up briefly, her face a picture of exhaustion and resolve. "She's still critical, Sheriff. I've done what I can for now. But I need to run some more tests." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Carl, the security guard, stepped inside again, accompanied by another officer. James's stomach sank as he noticed the serious expression on Carl's face. "Sheriff," Carl said, his tone almost pleading. "We need to have a word." James's eyes narrowed. His fists clenched at his sides. "No, we don't need to have a word, Carl. You've already made your choice. You and your colleagues need to stay out of Dr. Carter's way." The other officer, a younger man with a stern look on his face, stepped forward. "Sheriff, with all due respect, we've been told to make sure Dr. Carter does not perform any procedures without clearance from the administration." The words hit James like a thunderclap. "What?" His voice rose in disbelief. "You're telling me that the administration is trying to prevent Dr. Carter from saving my daughter?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "It's not like that, Sheriff. There's just a process." "A process." James's voice was colder now, his anger palpable. "There's a life on the line, and you're talking about process. This is my daughter, and you're telling me that her life is secondary to some bureaucratic nonsense." Carl stepped forward again, his face pale. "Sheriff, we're just doing our jobs. We don't want any trouble, but we've been ordered to follow protocol." James had heard enough. He could feel his blood boiling, the anger rising to the surface. "Listen to me, Carl. This ends now. No one is going to interfere with Dr. Carter's work. Not you, not the administration, not anyone. If I have to, I'll go directly to the board of directors and get this entire mess sorted out. But you will not stand in the way of my daughter's treatment any longer." The room was thick with tension. Carl and the younger officer exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught in a situation they didn't know how to handle. But James wasn't about to back down. Emily's life depended on it. "Dr. Carter," James said, turning back to the doctor, "don't let anyone tell you what to do. If they try to stop you, I'll handle it." Dr. Carter looked at him, gratitude and respect in her eyes. "I'll keep working, Sheriff. Don't worry. I'm not stopping." With that, James turned back to the security officers. "You both know what to do. Step aside. Now." The officers hesitated for a brief moment before nodding reluctantly. They turned and left the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind them, and the weight in the room lifted slightly. But James knew this wasn't the end. The system was broken, and it wasn't just the people in this hospital who needed to be held accountable. The fight against this kind of systemic racism would take more than just a few words. But right now, the most important thing was his daughter, and he would do whatever it took to make sure she had a chance at life. He looked down at Emily, her fragile body hooked up to machines, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. "Don't give up, Emily," he thought. "I'm not giving up on you. Not now. Not ever." As the door clicked shut behind the security officers, the room seemed to breathe a little easier. James stood there, watching Dr. Carter work, the weight of the situation still heavy on his shoulders. Emily, his precious daughter, was still fighting for her life, and every second mattered. The anger that had surged within him moments ago hadn't faded. It was still there, simmering under the surface. But now his focus was on one thing: making sure that Emily didn't have to fight this battle alone. Dr. Carter continued to adjust the IV lines, her hands steady despite the evident exhaustion on her face. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the occasional sound of her moving around the room. James felt helpless, standing there, but he knew there was little more he could do except be a presence of support. His mind kept returning to the words that Carl had said, the racism that had been allowed to fester, the denial of care because of Dr. Carter's race. How could this have happened? How had this poison taken root in his own community, in the very hospital that was supposed to be a sanctuary of care? It was a brutal reminder that no place, no matter how well-intentioned, was immune to the systemic injustices that plagued the world. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. A nurse entered, her face somber but determined. She was a woman James recognized from his many years in town. A compassionate, dedicated professional. She had seen him around the hospital countless times, but today her eyes held a different kind of determination. She wasn't just a nurse now. She was an ally. "Sheriff," she began quietly, "we've spoken to some of the other staff, and the word is getting around. People are beginning to understand how serious this is." She paused, looking at Emily, then at James. "But there's still a lot of resistance. Some are afraid of what might happen if they side with Dr. Carter." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Afraid. His voice was low, laced with disbelief. What are they afraid of? That they'll lose their jobs. That they'll have to face consequences for doing the right thing. The nurse nodded, her face a mask of frustration. "Yes, Sheriff. Some are scared. Others are complicit. They don't want to rock the boat. But there are a few of us who are willing to stand up. We're making sure Dr. Carter has everything she needs to do her job." James met her gaze, the gratitude in his eyes undeniable. "Thank you. Thank you for doing the right thing." He paused, his mind racing. He had known this hospital for years. He had grown up here. And now, he realized, it wasn't enough to just be upset. He had to make sure that the people responsible for blocking Dr. Carter, and those who had stood by, understood the full scope of their actions. "I'm going to take this to the board of directors," James said, his voice hardening. "This isn't just about my daughter anymore. This is about every person in this town who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin." The nurse nodded. "We'll back you, Sheriff. We'll make sure the truth comes out." James felt a fire ignite inside him. He wasn't going to let this go. The fight for his daughter was just the beginning. This was bigger than any single hospital room, bigger than his own pain. This was about changing a system that had failed so many for far too long. He turned back to Dr. Carter, who had now completed the procedure and was monitoring Emily's vitals. She glanced up at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. He could see the weight of the battle in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a quiet strength. She wasn't backing down, no matter how hard it got. "I'm not giving up on her," Dr. Carter said softly, as though reading his thoughts. "I'll keep fighting for Emily." James nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll fight with you. We're in this together." As he stood there, side by side with Dr. Carter, James knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time since Emily had been rushed to the hospital, he felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they would not only save his daughter, they would expose the ugliness that had tried to tear them apart, and in the process, they would fight for something greater than just one family's pain. They would fight for justice, for equality, for a future where no one had to fear being denied care because of the color of their skin. James left Emily's side for the first time in hours, his mind racing as he made his way to the hospital's administrative offices. The weight of the situation pressed down on him with every step, but his resolve had only hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been treated unfairly, for every patient who had been denied the care they deserved because of the color of their skin. This had to end, and it had to end now. As he walked through the sterile hallways, James felt the eyes of hospital staff on him. He had always been a familiar presence in these halls, a trusted figure who worked tirelessly to protect his community. But today, the look in their eyes was different. Some were supportive, their gazes filled with sympathy and silent solidarity. Others were hesitant, unsure of what the sheriff was going to do next. And some were just too afraid to speak up. When he reached the administrative wing, he didn't hesitate. The receptionist, a young woman with wide eyes, looked up as he approached. She seemed to recognize him immediately, but wasn't sure how to react. "Sheriff," she greeted him nervously. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with the board of directors." "Now," James said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had always accompanied his position. "It's urgent." The receptionist nodded quickly, sensing the gravity in his tone. She picked up the phone, speaking rapidly into the receiver, and within minutes, he was escorted to the office of the chief administrator, Dr. Garrett. A tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and a polished demeanor, Dr. Garrett greeted him with a strained smile. But the tension in the air was palpable. "Sheriff, what brings you here today?" Dr. Garrett asked, trying to sound cordial, but his eyes betrayed his unease. James wasted no time. "I know what's been happening in your emergency room. I know what your staff has been doing, and I'm not leaving until we get this straightened out." Dr. Garrett's expression faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "Sheriff, I'm not sure what you mean. What exactly are you implying?" James stood tall, unwavering. "My daughter, Emily. She's lying in a bed in your ER, fighting for her life, and she was denied critical care by your staff, your people, because of the color of Dr. Carter's skin. That's not just a breach of protocol. It's a violation of human decency." Dr. Garrett's face paled, but he quickly masked it with a forced, polite smile. "Sheriff, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. I'm confident that our staff acted in the best interest of your daughter." "Best interest?" James interrupted, his voice rising with anger. "You're telling me that the best interest of my daughter was to block the very doctor who could save her because she's black? That's not a misunderstanding. That's systemic racism, plain and simple." The administrator looked taken aback, but James wasn't finished. "I want a full investigation into this hospital's practices. I want every single person who stood in the way of Dr. Carter's care to be held accountable, and I'm not leaving here until I know that you're taking this seriously." Dr. Garrett hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on his desk. He could see the determination in James's eyes. He knew this wasn't going to be a fight he could dismiss or ignore, but the last thing he wanted was a public scandal, and James's words were a clear warning. "I'll make sure an internal review is conducted immediately, Sheriff," Dr. Garrett said, his voice barely audible. "We'll look into it, I promise. But I need to ask for your understanding. These things take time." James's gaze never wavered. "I don't have time. My daughter doesn't have time. You have 24 hours to take action, or I'll take it from here. If anyone tries to prevent Dr. Carter from treating my daughter, I'll make sure this hospital never operates again." Dr. Garrett opened his mouth to protest, but James turned on his heel, heading for the door. "And don't think for one second that I'm going to stop until this is fixed," James added, his voice cold. "I'm watching." As James exited the office, his mind was still a whirlwind. He had made the demand, but the battle wasn't over. He knew that Dr. Garrett and the board would stall, would try to sweep this under the rug, but he wasn't going to let them. His daughter's life was at stake, and this fight was bigger than anything he had ever faced. The fight had only just begun. James returned to the ER with a heavy heart, his mind racing with everything he had just demanded from Dr. Garrett and the board. He wasn't naive. He knew the battle wouldn't be easy. The systemic racism that had infiltrated the hospital wouldn't vanish overnight, and Dr. Garrett's promises felt hollow in the face of the larger, more deeply ingrained issues. But James wasn't backing down. For his daughter, for his community, and for everyone who had ever suffered in silence, he would fight until the very end. When he stepped back into Emily's room, the exhaustion on Dr. Carter's face told him everything he needed to know. But the moment she saw him, a flicker of relief passed through her eyes, even though she didn't have the energy to say much. "Sheriff," Dr. Carter said quietly, her voice barely audible as she adjusted a tube. "You're back. What happened?" "I've taken it to the board. I made it clear that this has to stop," James replied, his voice low but determined. "I gave them 24 hours to act, or I'll make sure the public knows what's been happening here. We're not letting them hide this any longer." Dr. Carter nodded, her face a mixture of gratitude and fatigue. "I appreciate that, Sheriff. But I'll be honest, I don't know how much longer I can keep up this fight. Emily's condition is still critical, and there's only so much I can do with the resources available." James looked down at his daughter, still lying unconscious, her body hooked to numerous machines. His chest tightened as he thought of the injustice that had put her in this position. She didn't deserve this. No one did. He placed a hand on Dr. Carter's shoulder, offering her what little support he could. "You've been doing everything you can. You're not alone in this fight. We're going to see this through, Dr. Carter. I won't let them destroy you, or anyone else, because of the color of your skin." The sound of footsteps approaching pulled them from their quiet moment. It was Carl, the security guard, returning with a different expression on his face. He was no longer the man who had blocked Dr. Carter's access to Emily. His shoulders were slumped, and his gaze was less confrontational. "Sheriff," Carl said, his voice hesitant. I wanted to apologize. I didn't realize how deep this went. I was just following orders, but I can't stand by and let people suffer because of something like this." James studied Carl for a moment before speaking, his tone softer now. "I understand, Carl. A lot of people don't realize what's going on until they see it for themselves. It's easy to follow orders when you're not the one who's being harmed." Carl nodded, looking at Emily with visible remorse. "I wish I had done more sooner. I just didn't know. But I'll do whatever I can now." James appreciated the sincerity in Carl's words. He wasn't the enemy. He was a man caught in a system that was larger than any one individual. The problem wasn't the people, it was the system they were forced to operate in. "Thank you," James said quietly. "All we need is to make sure this doesn't happen again. We've got to stop the cycle." Carl nodded again. "I'll help however I can. You have my word." With Carl's support, James felt a sense of progress, but there was still a long road ahead. As they worked together to ensure Emily had the best possible care, they knew the fight for justice wasn't just about one hospital or one community. It was about changing an entire system that had been built on inequality. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no turning back. The following day, as the sun began to set over the small town, James sat in his truck outside the hospital, waiting. He had spoken to the board of directors, made his demands clear, and now he was waiting to see if they would follow through. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the quiet tension that had settled over him. It was a message from Dr. Carter. "Sheriff, they're stalling. The board has agreed to an investigation, but they're giving me the cold shoulder. They're dragging their feet, and I fear they'll let Emily slip through the cracks." James clenched his jaw. He had feared this outcome. Administrators, when pushed, often deferred action until the pressure eased or the public interest waned. But he couldn't afford to wait. Emily couldn't afford to wait. He typed a quick reply. "Keep fighting. I'm not letting this go. We'll go public if we have to." With his mind made up, James started the truck and drove back to the sheriff's office, where he began preparing the documents that would expose the hospital's failure. He wasn't a lawyer, but he understood the power of information and the weight of public scrutiny. He knew that the only way to break through the walls the administration had erected was to force them to confront the truth. James sat at his desk, compiling notes, statements from witnesses, and legal resources. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, drafting a public statement to share with the local news outlets. His phone buzzed again, this time a call from an unexpected source. His deputy, Claire. "Sheriff, we've been contacted by some of the hospital staff. They want to help," Claire said, her voice tense but urgent. "A few of the nurses and techs have come forward, but they're afraid of retaliation. They're asking if you can help make sure they don't lose their jobs or worse." James leaned back in his chair, the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. These weren't just faceless people he was fighting for. These were members of his own community, workers who were now facing the same moral dilemma that he had faced. Stay silent and keep their jobs, or risk it all to do what was right. "I'll make sure they're protected," James said, determination in his voice. "Get their statements, Claire. We'll need them when we take this public." After hanging up, James gathered the information he had, taking extra care to ensure everything was solid. He couldn't afford any mistakes. If he went public, It had to be irrefutable. He knew he had to strike quickly before the hospital could sweep the incident under the rug. As night fell, he sent the prepared statements to several local news outlets, hoping the media would pick up the story before the hospital had a chance to spin it. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about saving his daughter anymore. It was about holding the system accountable and making sure that no other family would have to suffer the same injustice. The next morning, the story hit the news. Headlines blared across local stations. Sheriff's daughter denied critical care due to racism. Hospital under investigation. The pressure was immediate, and within hours, Dr. Garrett called James. "I can assure you, Sheriff, we are taking this very seriously," Dr. Garrett said, his voice tight with stress. "We're launching an independent review of the situation." James didn't buy it. "It's too late for that," he replied. "I want the public to know the truth. If you're truly serious about fixing this, start with accountability. Until then, we're not backing down." As James ended the call, he felt a shift. It wasn't over, but the first real crack in the system had appeared. The public pressure was building, and now the hospital would have no choice but to confront its failures. Emily's fight for survival had ignited something far greater than just her life. It had sparked a reckoning, and James would make sure it would continue until justice was served.